Very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation, Anthony. Great to be with you. I wasn't asked for a title for this, and I've seen it variously described as Pope Francis and Amoris Laetitia, so I will try and deliver. I can certainly deliver on both of those. But the title of the talk today actually is The Francis Option: How to Evangelize a World in Flux. Now, this is the product of a book I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years, which is a follow-up to The Great Reformer, about the 5 years of the pontificate, seeking to answer the question, what is it that Francis is trying to do? What is it he is seeking to change? And that's taken me back into the origins of the pontificate, in many ways, the big thinking behind the pontificate. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. I want to begin by mentioning a book which some of you may have heard of, which came out last year, by a well-known conservative. He's actually no longer a Catholic, he's Orthodox, but he's called Rod Dreher, and he wrote a book called The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. I don't know whether any of you heard about it. It was widely discussed in America. Now, although he's quoted often in it, the Benedict of the title is not, in fact, Pope Benedict, but St. Benedict of Nursia, the founder of Western monasticism. So Rod Dreher's argument in this book is that we have entered a new pagan dark age of liquidity and dissolution in which mass consumer capitalism, liberal individualism have achieved a decisive victory, and that attempts to, the end of Christendom, if you like, is being accelerated. Attempts to win the public square have been lost, rather than now invest energies in trying to win these unwinnable political battles to sort of gain spaces in the state and in culture. Christians should now beat a kind of strategic retreat into what he calls stable communities of faith, where, like, in his view, the monasteries of the early Middle Ages, they can, quote, build a Christian way of life that stands as an island of sanctity and stability amid the high tide of liquid modernity, unquote. Now, there are many problems with this. Only an American with a Calvinist view of St. Augustine could come up with that kind of dualistic church and world idea. And I think also he misreads monasticism very badly, as a number of monks have pointed out. But I come here not to critique Rod Dreher, but merely to say, to point out something very interesting about his book, which is that he and Pope Francis share a common view of modernity. Both have a stark, even I would say apocalyptic view of the contemporary age as the triumph of globalized democracy in which institutions, families, the bonds of belonging have been shattered and dissolved. And both see that the acceleration of this trend, the detachment of law and culture from the essence of Christian faith, which we call secularization and relativism, I see a very, very similar reading of both of them. And both believe that it is myopic to invest energy and resources into trying to cling on to those spaces of power and privilege. And if we needed an example, the recent referendum in Ireland on abortion should be a demonstration of that. Now, what I find interesting is that, if anything, Francis is even more apocalyptic than Dreher about modernity. I mean, consider his view of globalized technocracy in Laudato Si. The preparatory document for this October's Synod on Young People also contains a very stark view of the contemporary age. Something you probably won't have heard about, but there was an address he gave to the Catholic University in Santiago de Chile in January, in which he spoke in language that one would normally associate with a very conservative outlook of a post-1968 cultural breakdown, the loss of a sense of people, of family, of nation. And he talked about life becoming increasingly fragmented and polarised, even violent. So I don't want to bang on about this, I just want to make the point very simply, and it's a very simple point. Francis may be joyful, he may be full of hope, but he is not a liberal optimist about modernity. And I think it is a fatal misreading to see him as that. But what I want to call here this morning the Francis option is the very opposite of the Benedict option. So the option of Evangelization is a call not to retreat into bunkers, not to seal the doors, not to retire to Jansenist citadels, but the very opposite, to go out, la iglesia en salida, chiesa in uscita, the church that goes out to evangelize, on mission, to open wide the doors, to build bridges. The liquidity out there is not a reason, in other words, to raise the drawbridge, but to build bridges and life rafts to rebuild, if you like, from below. So the Francis option is essentially the option of CELAM, which is the Latin American Episcopal Council. You know, they held, it's the continent-wide Episcopal body. They held a historic meeting in Aparecida, Brazil in May 2007, which produced a document which is in a sense the foundation of this papacy. And the argument of the Aparecida document is that the evangelization of today's world requires a pastoral conversion, rooted in an individual and ecclesial experience of Christ's mercy, which generates missionary disciples. It is a call to the church to be close and concrete, to accompany, to facilitate the personal encounter with God. That is essentially the Francis option, that is the Latin American option, if you like. But here's where it gets interesting. Why was it necessary for the Latin American church to call for a pastoral and missionary conversion? Why is a conversion needed? Why does the church need to change, in other words? What was failing in the evangelization model of the Europe-centred church, to which Aparecida and the Francis papacy are, if you like, the Holy Spirit's answer? And indeed, what is that answer? So I'm going to answer this in three parts. I'm going to begin with a little bit of background of the Aparecida signs of the times discernment about modernity, and then get to explain how, using some of Francis's old writings, part of that discernment was that the universal church had fallen into some of the temptations of desolation in Ignatian terms, and therefore was failing to evangelize. And then in the third part, I'll try and explain, but it should be fairly obvious to you by then, that Francis's attempt to refocus the church and why mercy and the Beatitudes are the cornerstone of his evangelization. Okay? So let's begin. The change of era. Aparecida was the fruit of the most sophisticated signs of the times discernment of the church, of any part of the church in the world. It's quite striking when I did research on this to find the extent to which Aparecida was prepared for by a series of really elaborate conferences and analyses, which were collated by the then CELAM General Secretary, who's now Archbishop of Mexico City, Carlos Aguiaretes, who collated the insights of all these gatherings in a very important document in 2003 called Globalization and the New Evangelization in Latin America, which shows indeed how the forces of technocracy and globalization, which he describes as the principal detonator and accelerator of postmodernity, were sweeping away the weak belonging of cultural Christianity and bringing in an era of a new pluralism, together with new forms of social and economic exclusion alongside concentrations of wealth. The Latin American church always looks at the socio-economic alongside everything else. And he spoke there, as would Aparecida, of a cambio de época, a change of era, a cambio de época rather than an época de cambio, rather than an era of change, a change of era, a kind of epochal shift in which new turbulence engendered by this new phase of modernity, which was marked by information rather than industry, digital rather than mechanical, was doing away with the traditional supports of faith, as well as the traditional mechanisms of the transmission of faith, above all in society, culture, law and family. Now this change of era, he argued, required a new evangelization, and that this couldn't be primarily intellectual because Western rationality was in crisis, nor could it rely on structures and power alliances, if you like, the traditional Christendom model, because these were increasingly secular. The task was to help the faithful to have a personal encounter with Jesus Christ in this context of liquidity. And he talked about new circles of discipleship in which our hearts can find the answers to our deepest anxieties, of prayer, of gospel reading, and so on. Now, at the same time, the change of era demanded that the church stand by those who have been crucified by the new global economy, embracing not just those who are materially poor, but who are victims of exclusion and solitude, the breakup of society, if you like, in its many forms. So in this context of cultural, religious pluralism, Catholics needed to be both rooted and clear in their belonging, while at the same time working actively to build unity out of this reconciled diversity. Now, Aparecida took for granted that Christianity is being squeezed out from law and culture. As I say, the Irish referendum should be a great example of that. Under pressure from the secular individualism brought about by globalised technocracy. Now, in this context, Aparecida said, a Catholic faith which is reduced to a mere baggage, to a collection of rules and prohibitions, fragmented devotional practices, selective and partial adherence to the truths of the faith, occasional participation in some sacraments, they said, bland, nervous moralising, all this, they said, is going to be swept away. It's not going to stand the trials of time. So Aparecida warns that the move from conservation to a missionary pastoral ministry would require on the part of the church spiritual, pastoral and institutional reforms to make the church visibly present as a mother who reaches out, a welcoming home, a constant school of missionary conversion. So you see that from the beginning there's an analysis that the church has to change in response to this. Now, a year after Aparecida, Cardinal Bergoglio in Buenos Aires spoke of this change to his priests, and he says, what is proper of this change of era is that things are no longer in their place. The way in which we have been situated in history has changed. What seemed normal to us about the family, the church, society, the world, is not going back to what it was. So he was basically saying things are shifting under you. And he went on that rather than lamenting this situation, Aparecida sees this as an invitation to discern with the light of the Holy Spirit in what way we must now put ourselves at the service of the kingdom of God. So the reaction to change should not be one of lament or anger, but one of discernment. What is the Holy Spirit asking of us in this time of rapid change and liquidity? And the answer, of course, that Aparecida gave was to renew a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Now, Bergoglio went on to speak of a series of criteria that Aparecida offered, at the heart of which is this pastoral conversion, which implies a change of mentality, attitudes and behaviour. So the change of era is an invitation to put Christ essentially back at the centre. To become a church with evangelising audacity, parousia, means recovering the experience of God, to begin again from Christ, recognising his presence with the same sense of novelty and reality, the same power of affection, persuasion and hope that the early disciples had. He went on to list then a series of characteristics of this pastoral conversion, which of course appear in Evangelization, which I know you'll be familiar with. Now, one of these was pastoral action with a Samaritan heart, the Latin American church, the Samaritan church, one that attends to people in their concrete needs and suffering. So Aparecida saw the uprooting, which is really called kind of desocialization, let's just call it the uprooting, in three main ways. First of all, there's an affective uprooting in the sense that the dissolution of bonds of belonging to family, to community and institutions is producing in us a deep psychological and emotional anguish. Anguish is a good word, I think, to describe it. Secondly, existentially, in the sense that it's much harder to have a clear identity and a sense of self in this new liquidity. It's harder to make plans, it's harder to know who we are, it's harder to build a future. And then in a third sense there's a spiritual uprooting because there's a loss of transcendence, of signs and of symbols that connect the present with the eternal. That's one of the consequences of secularization. So as a good Samaritan, the church's response to this woundedness was also threefold: to help people reconnect with creation and the world as creatures of God, hence Laudato Si, to know directly his love and mercy, the Jubilee of Mercy, to experience family and community, the bonds of trust and unconditional love that will build resilience, character and self-esteem, Amoris Laetitia, and to help people find sanctuary, places of peace, privacy and prayer, to guide them also into what it means to be holy, Gaudete et Exsultate. So to discern the spirits and open up the channels of God's grace. So you can see here the shaping of this conviction that the church must be close and concrete. Now, these are two words that Francis uses all the time. Vicinanza concretezza in Italian. The church has to be close and concrete. And it's fascinating how, when he uses this term, why he uses it. And the idea is basically, in a liquid and technocratic society, the church's besetting temptation, if you like, the problem with all institutions, is to become abstract and remote. So the church must show a God who attends the particular, who is attentive to the particular, to the concrete, to the individual, to the person, to realities rather than ideas. Close and concrete, of course, essentially the signs of the incarnation. That's how God saves us, is by being close and concrete. He became a human. It was born into a human family in that place in Palestine at that year. That is how God saves. Now, this is something that Bergoglio has been insisting on in his early writings, actually, and right up, in 1997, for example, as an auxiliary bishop in the Synod in Rome, he spoke about the disenchantment of the contemporary world. Faced with a lack of hope, the Lord is moved, comes down, and gets close. We must rediscover his way of coming near in order to evangelize. So the key word, he said, is proximity. Encounter, conversion, communion and solidarity are the categories that express the proximity that opens the way to hope. We will only rediscover Christ if the church is close and concrete, if we have that concrete experience. Second part, then, a church in a time of tribulation. What has gone wrong? So why did a parousia need to call for this deep rethinking, this pastoral conversion? Hadn't Vatican II basically reset the church, the contemporary Catholicism? Indeed, in response to the end of Christendom, that was not what Vatican II was all about. The answer is, of course, yes. But something had gone wrong in the reception of the council. For Latin American church leaders such as Aguiar, Retes and Bergoglio, the tribulation of post-1968 relativism and secularism had triggered in the rich world church, the European-centred church, if you like, a state of spiritual desolation. Rather than discern and reform, as the council had called the church to do, the church had too often reacted by means of an intellectual, ethical and juridical defence, becoming, in the process, distant and abstract. Faced by the threat to Christian values from relativism and secularism, the well-known attacks on the church in law and so on, the church had focused on the defence of those spaces, quite understandably, rather than attending to the breakup of the people of God that was going on below. So the result was to reinforce the juridical preconciliar idea of faith as a moral code or a philosophy, as an idea, in other words, or an ideology. Now, in his wonderful intellectual biography of Pope Francis, Massimo Borghese, by the way, his book is coming out in September, you must read it, it's called The Mind of Pope Francis, it's published by Collegeville. Massimo talks about, in that book, of an ethicist deviation, which is essentially the strategy that the church too often has adopted in response to the threat of secularism. And effectively that this ethicist deviation is a strategy for resistance, but not for renaissance. It's incapable of evangelizing. And I had, by the way, an example of that a few weeks ago in Ireland, where I was asked to speak, and I gave a talk that was not dissimilar to this. Everybody after me, this was a week before the referendum, every single talk was on relativism and secularism, heavy analyses of the threat to the church and so on. And at the end of it, I just felt so deeply depressed, and I thought, there is no good news here. There is no good news here for the poor and for everybody. That's part of the understandable response to threat. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Benedict spotted this a long time ago. Benedict XVI spotted this. That he shared this discernment of where contemporary Catholicism had effectively gone wrong. Right at the start of his first encyclical Deus Caritas Est of 2005, he pointed out that, quote, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. It's a very famous quote. Now, interestingly, that quote, if you're a detective and you're looking for the origins of this papacy, that quote appears in Deus Caritas Est. It appears right on the front of the Aparecido document of 2007. It's then repeated by Pope Francis in Evangelization, where he says he never tires of repeating it, and he says those words take us to the very heart of the gospel. So, as I say, if you're a detective, and if you want to keep going, I can tell you where it also turns up in other documents of this pontificate. It's a very, very... So here is something that links the Benedict and the Francis papacies very clearly. A shared diagnosis of where the church was going on. In 2004, Cardinal Bergoglio gave a talk on the 10th anniversary of Veritatis Splendor, in which he praised St. John Paul II's courageous defence of objective truth and objective morality in a de-Christianised culture. But he focused on a part of the encyclical which very few people talk about, namely the centrality of grace in the Gospel's call to the moral life. Living the love to which Christ calls us is impossible by our own efforts, John Paul II points out, and it was only possible by a virtue of a gift received. And Bergoglio quotes John Paul quoting St. Augustine, the famous question, is it the keeping of the commandments that earns God's love, or is it the other way around? Have we been first loved by God, and that is why we keep the commandments? And Bergoglio went on to wonder, this is him now, whether it was because Christian morality was so often reduced to a lofty precept, to a set of, if you like, commandments, that contemporary humanity had succumbed to the grave temptation in which precisely Veritas Splendor warns against, namely relativism, in which man becomes the measure of what is good and bad. In other words, if morality is presented as a precept without grace, right, it becomes something threatening, to which relativism is, if you like, the response of freedom. If truth is presented as an iron cage, you want to break out of the iron cage. It's a very interesting idea. He just sort of speculates, really. But here we have, rather than treat relativism as an erroneous philosophy which needs to be argued against, Bergoglio discerns in it a rebellion against moral authoritarianism, a rejection of precisely Christianity presented as a moral code without grace, presented as an idea of titanic effort, rather than a response of the heart to God's mercy. So many of his writings and addresses show this concern at the way truth has become detached from goodness and beauty, from love and from mercy in the framing of the Christian offer. And this is what he means when he criticises in Evangelization what he calls eticismo sin bondad, which is rather badly translated as ethical systems bereft of goodness. In English it sounds a bit ridiculous, but in Spanish very clear, ethicism without goodness. In which the church ends up presenting doctrines that are effectively philosophical rather than gospel, and so on. Now, in November 2012, while giving a retreat to Caritas in Buenos Aires, I mentioned this in The Great Reformer, he was giving a retreat to Caritas, and he says, do you think that the woman who is forgiven by Jesus in John chapter 8, the adulterous woman, as she's often described, did she go back to her life of promiscuity? And then he says, well, of course, the gospel doesn't tell us. But he says, you can be sure that she didn't, because no one who has encountered that much mercy is capable of departing from the law. It's the consequence. It's a very, very strong statement. But you see there the idea. It is the encounter with mercy that makes us moral rather than, if you like, the other way around. He also spoke in that retreat of truth being like a precious stone, that when it's offered in the hand seduces and captivates, but when it's hurled at people wounds them. It's the same stone in both instances, but the effect is very different. It's the same truth, but the effect is very different. So, in other words, love without truth is not of God. Even if it might be true, but it's not of God. And so in Bergoglio's Ignatian reading, the church in desolation has too often been tempted to an ethical defensive response, which is precisely what Aquinas is rejecting. That's why in Evangelization he warns against the yeast of the Pharisees, rebuking those who long for a monolithic body of doctrine guarded by all and leaving no room for nuance, who speak more of law than of grace, more of the church than Christ, or who imply that Christianity is a kind of stoicism or self-denial or a moral code. And you can see this critique in Gaudete et Exsultate of Gnosticism and Pelagianism. But it's interesting to know where this is coming from, this Signs of the Times discernment. Now, what's the evidence for me saying that Francis saw the rich world church in kind of desolation and succumbing to these temptations? Because in the 1980s, he wrote about the temptations faced by ecclesial bodies in times of tribulation. He was writing generally, but the Society of Jesus in Argentina was going through great tribulation at the time himself. Now, he wrote about this in above all 3 texts. And he made use of those texts recently, fascinatingly, in his response to the crisis of the church in Chile, which I'm sure you've all been following. A crisis, of course, which is essentially rooted in institutional failure and secularization. Now, so the response, he draws on these old texts of his in responding to that. Firstly, in his address to the clergy and religious in Santiago on January the 16th. Secondly, in the 3 letters he's written in response. So first letter was to Chile's bishops after he received Archbishop Sciclina's report. The second one he gave to the bishops when they arrived in Rome, which was subsequently leaked. And there's a third letter to the people of God in Chile. Fascinating. They've been collectively described as a kind of Chilean encyclical. But what's so interesting about them is that they chart a roadmap out of the church's desolation, faced with persecution and failure, into a state of consolation and mission, in which they are again capable of evangelizing. And in the January speech, he takes the example of St. Peter, who had failed Christ, had betrayed Christ, being forgiven by the risen Christ in the famous exchange, do you love me, and so on. But he shows in this speech how Christ is taking Peter, forgiving Peter, and allowing Peter to to escape the temptations, if you like, of ruminating on his own desolation and failure, and which allows him to focus then again outwards. Now, what's so interesting is that this process, which he's been enabling with the Chilean bishops, as I said, has a significance, I think, well beyond Chile, because the sources of that church's desolation are the same ones of the church in the Western world in general. Secularization, which has changed the view of Christianity in the church in popular culture, if you like. And secondly, institutional dysfunction, which I don't need to talk about, because we're all very familiar with it. Clericalism, institutional idolatry, spectacularly, of course, exposed in the clerical sex abuse crisis. In which have required external pressure from victims, from the media, and finally, now in this case, from the Pope himself to face up to. It's the story of the Western Church, in other words, in these past 2 or 3 decades. Now, among the temptations in times of tribulation that Bergoglio identified was a turning inwards, remember he talked about being becoming self-referential, in which we ruminate on our desolation. We have an exaggerated sense of persecution and victimhood. We are victims, everybody is against us. The temptation in that circumstance is to adopt a Manichaean view of the other as bad and ourselves as good. We lose our peace of mind, we become authoritarian, we become controlling, and rather than focus on the spiritual confusion created by the attacks, we try and respond to the attacks themselves at the level of ideas. So in response to relativism, we reassert objectivity, moral truth, and so on. In this way, we are drawn by the bad spirit, by the devil, into essentially imitating the bad spirit's own way, his own way, right? Because to engage a bad spirit attack on the intellectual realm is to collude in a deceit. Because the truth, as Benedict says so well, is that the truth is not an idea, but a person, Jesus Christ, the encounter with whom changes our horizon. Because he is love and mercy. So the temptation is that we end up defending ourselves by asserting the truth, but what gets missed out is the person at the heart of it who is love and mercy. So an intellectual self-defense risks taking away the focus from Christ, and so presenting the truth in a way that is unloving. Or the opposite risk is to present truth in a loving way, but while betraying the truth itself. And this is what Jesus, Francis says in this talk, this is what Jesus is saving Peter from in his forgiveness. I'm going to quote now from the Chile speech. He wants to save him from the destructive attitude of becoming a victim, or thinking, what does it matter, which waters down any commitment and ends up in the worst sort of relativism. Jesus wants to set him free from seeing his opponents as enemies and being upset by opposition and criticism. He wants to free him from being downcast and, above all, negative. By his question, Jesus asks Peter to listen to his heart and to learn how to discern. Since it was not God's way to defend the truth at the cost of charity, or charity at the cost of truth, or to smooth things away at the cost of both, that would be false hereticism. Peter has to discern. Jesus wants to avoid turning Peter into someone who hurts others by telling the truth, or is kind to others by telling lies, or simply someone paralysed by his own uncertainty, as can happen to us in these situations. It's quite brilliant stuff. It's a brilliant description of the trap that the Western Church has fallen into in its response to secularization, in both its liberal and its conservative responses. In each case, the problem is that the obstacle or the threat, in this case modernity, what we call it modernity, liquidity, becomes the focus rather than Jesus. And by a process of mimetic contagion, René Girard would say, the church has ended up emulating that threat. So the temptation is essentially the one that Peter surrenders to in Matthew 14, when Jesus invites him to step off the boat, right? And rather than focus on Jesus, he sees the waves. So it's a question about focus. The fear led him to take his eyes off Christ and to focus on the waves. So the parallel here is the church focused on the threat of secularism and relativism and stopped talking about Jesus. The task for Peter and for his church is to convert. That's the need of conversion. To refocus. To no longer put ourselves or the institution of the church at the centre, but Christ. Only then will we be able to evangelize. So how to do this? How do we start again from Christ? Well, Peter's healing, the way through desolation and tribulation, is to emulate essentially Jesus' self-abasement, sinctacabasis. In his 1984 article called On Self-Accusation, Bergoglio writes about how accusing yourself before Christ, receiving his mercy, is a powerful antidote to the kind of mimetic cycle of mutual recrimination and scapegoating, which are the temptations in the time of tribulation. So a refocusing on God's mercy must begin by focusing on our own realities of sin and failure, and following Jesus' example by then washing the feet of others, service, not domination. Rather than blaming the culture for our failure to evangelize, we have to ask, where did we go wrong? How must we change? Only when we convert, in short, are we capable of evangelizing. By facing its wounds, by allowing itself to receive God's mercy, and then going out to serve those who are also wounded, the church becomes a sign of the transfigured community, capable of evangelizing because it performs and embodies the good news of which it speaks. You know, the message and the reality are coherent. This is what pastoral conversion means. It means a journey from institutional introspection focused on an ethical or intellectual response to de-Christianization, which of course only exacerbates the cycle, to a Christ-centered focus in which the receiving and giving of God's mercy recenters the church on the concrete needs of those who are suffering and deprived. Such a witness to God's mercy is at the heart, of course, of the Christian proclamation. And just as in an individual's conversion in response to God's mercy, in this pastoral conversion, the church's sinful failures, its betrayal of the gospel, its neglect or abuse of the vulnerable, its obsession with power and privilege, are what paradoxically become the source of its redemption. The knowledge and embrace of its wounds frees the church from self-focus and the illusion of superiority. Salvation, in other words, comes from Christ, not from our own strength. A church with wounds can understand the wounds of today's world and make them her own, suffering with them, accompanying them, and seeking to heal them. That's a quote from Francis in Santiago. He added, a wounded church does not make herself the centre of things, does not believe that she is perfect, but puts at the centre the one who can heal those wounds, whose name is Jesus Christ. It's all about a re-centering, a hermeneutic shift. And this is what he describes in Peter's journey. To know both Peter disheartened and Peter transfigured, as he puts it, is an invitation to pass from a church that serves, to pass from being a church of the unhappy and disheartened to becoming a church that serves all the people who are unhappy and disheartened in our midst. This is pastoral conversion, which is the necessary precondition for evangelizing a world in flux. Now, in Francis's reality check letter to the bishops, that's the one that leaked, the second one, he invited them to recall when the church in Chile was prophetic, outward-focused, courageous, and committed to the defence of the poorest. And he invited them to discern its characteristics. When you were that church, remember how it was, right? And think about what the characteristics were of that church. It put Christ at the centre. It evangelized. It was joyful because it was close to the people. It generated holiness. It defended the poor. And it was humble enough to confess its sins. Then he invited them to see where it had gone wrong. This is not a Pope who spares it. How it became clerical and authoritarian. How it usurped the consciences of the faithful. How it became elitist, full of closed circles. And faced with the crisis, the sex abuse scandals, turned in on itself, defended itself, scapegoated, blamed others, tried to save its reputation. We want to pass from being a church centred on itself, he says, to them, weighed down and desolate from sin, to a church that serves all those who are weighed down. It's the same idea. Only a wounded church that embraces its wounds is capable of serving a wounded world. So that's why Pansione Evangelization called for a conversion. Now, it was clear from the October 2012 Synod, the one that Benedict called on the new evangelization, which I think was a genius move, by the way. He understood that something was wrong. It was very obvious, I was there, that Synod was in desolation. The rich church, the European church and the American church, they had long speeches denouncing relativism and secularism, how we're persecuted, while actually the Christians who were being persecuted, genuinely persecuted in Egypt and Syria, they had a very different voice, one of joy and so on. So it was very interesting as a kind of discernment exercise to see where the different voices were coming from. And it was clear from the Latin American church, they had a very different voice. It was pastoral, it was missionary, it was engaged, it was concerned, it was joyful. And where the first was blaming the culture for the church's shrinking congregations. And it's so hard to be Catholic now, our congregations, our churches are emptying because in the attacks from the government and our law and so on. Rather than blaming the culture for the church's shrinking congregations and calling for a kind of doubling down of the church's defiant ethical positions, or indeed putting its faith in this or that program or movement or whatever, the Latin American bishops called for the church to make a profound examination of conscience, to admit its faults and to be open to the Holy Spirit. Quote, "We do not speak of the new evangelization simply because the others have changed," they said. This is the Latin American group. Yeah? The moment has arrived to ask ourselves, what are the sins of the church that have led to the new evangelization? So this humility was itself a sign of consolation. In self-accusation, the text I quoted from earlier, he shows how accusing ourselves breaks the cycle of mimetic blame and recrimination. By looking to God's mercy to justify us rather than our own goodness, we create room for the Holy Spirit to act. And this, of course, is what Pope Francis has been seeking to do in relation to Chile. His self-accusation, his own historic apology, a remarkable apology, has actually changed the whole dynamic of the whole church. Now, some of the bishops are saying, yeah, you know what, we got it wrong, we need to change. They offered their resignations, as you know. Amazing, that one act of the Pope blaming himself, saying, I messed up, I was badly informed, I got it wrong, has broken that cycle. So only a few months after that 2012 synod, as you know, came Benedict's resignation and the conclave, on the eve of which Cardinal Bergoglio gave that famous address describing a church that was bent over, paralysed and incapable of evangelising because of its self-focus, and how Jesus was knocking on the inside of the door asking to be let out, his famous reframing, if you like, of the Revelation, famous Revelation text. He said in Buenos Aires, actually, our problem is we have Jesus tied up in the sanctuary and we don't let him out. Quoting Evangelii Nazianzi, the great doctor, he told the cardinals that the church's very reason for being was the sweet and comforting joy of evangelising. And then, of course, defined evangelisation famously as going out to the peripheries, to wherever there was sin and suffering and lack of closeness to God. So in a sense, he was presenting the cardinals at that point with a hermeneutical choice. It's the question of the spiritual exercises. Where is your focus? When the church averts its eyes from Christ, it becomes sick and self-referential, lives from its own light, bent over like the woman in Luke 13. But when the focus goes back onto Christ, the church looks outward and becomes missionary. And then, as you know, Bergoglio famously says, the next pope should be, he said, a man who, through the contemplation of Christ, helps the church to go out from itself towards the peripheries. Now, the cardinals who were with him from Latin America in that conclave recognised that, his words, because that was very similar to the speech he gave in 2007, when he talked about the Holy Spirit leading the church towards every human periphery of pain, injustice, ignorance, solitude, and so on, that was crying out to be evangelised. The effect of the Holy Spirit, he had said then, was to free the church from the sufficiency of our own knowledge that leads to the gnosis. And in pushing it to evangelise, frees us from becoming a self-referential church, like the bent-over woman in the Gospel, who does nothing more than look at herself, with the people of God elsewhere. So, third part, evangelisation through mercy and the Beatitudes. So this last quote from his speech, with the church bent over itself, looking at herself, with the people of God elsewhere, is actually a constant theme of his as well, this idea of the people of God. What he says to the Chilean bishops, in a sense, is reconnect with the people of God. Notice the church may be failing, may be shrinking, but the people of God is still there. So for Francis, Lumen Gentium 12 is the key. The people of God is infallible in matters of faith. Christ has already spoken to the people of God. They carry the seed of the gospel. Right? So that the task of the institutional church is to connect with that, to serve it, to awaken it, if you like. In the lead letter to the Chilean bishops, he says, the holy and patient people of God, sustained and vivified by the Holy Spirit, is the best face of the prophetic church that knows how to place at the centre their Lord in their daily lives. In this faithful people that knows itself to be sinful, yet knows how to ask forgiveness because it believes in the Father's mercy. In that faithful, silent people, he says, resides the immune system of the church. The church must recover from the people of God. It's incapable of its own self-regeneration because the centre, the institution, always looks after itself. He then goes on to critique elitist groups and closed circles that end up in narcissistic and authoritarian spiritualities, in which rather than evangelizing, what matters is to feel special or different from others. These clericalisms and elitisms are all synonymous, he says, with the perversion of ecclesial identity. And the very similar critiques appear in Evangelization. So evangelizing is to serve the people of God. It is to make known the presence of Christ already in the people of God. Christ is already there among them. Right? We don't have this clerical idea that we have God and we take it to people who don't know it. It's a very different conception. At Mass in Asunción in Paraguay in July 2015, Francis invited people to see mission and evangelization, not in terms of plans and programs, we love our plans and our programs, of strategies and tactics and maneuvers and techniques, as if all depended on our arguments or the strength of our resources. Because he says in the mindset of the gospel, you do not convince people with arguments, strategies or tactics. You convince them by simply learning how to welcome them. Evangelization, in other words, is about creating the space for conversion, for opportunities for God's grace to reach people, which means accepting and understanding the limitations and pressures under which they operate, especially in liquid modernity. In describing in Santiago de Chile a consoled church of service, Francis said the question was not about feeding the poor or the naked or the sick, but rather recognizing that the poor, the naked, the sick, the prisoners and the homeless have the dignity to sit at our table, to feel at home among us, to feel part of a family. This is the sign that the kingdom of God is in our midst. What captivates people is the sign of the kingdom. And this is the sign of a church wounded by sin, shown mercy by the Lord, and made prophetic by his call. So many of Francis's reforms and initiatives, one thinks of the synods, Amoris, Laetitia, the Year of Mercy, are precisely for this, to encourage an openness to grace. In a world in flux, it is harder for people to be good. It is harder to be moral in a world in flux. It's harder to have long-lasting marriages. It's harder to make commitments to anything, let alone the church. It's harder to live ordered lives, to be in community, to stay together. In other words, people need help in liquid modernity, or rather, God is already seeking to help them, and that the church must facilitate that. As he says in Amoris Laetitia, chapter 2, which for me is the key chapter in that document, we have long thought that simply by stressing doctrinal, bioethical and moral issues, without encouraging openness to grace, we were providing sufficient support to families, strengthening the marriage bond and giving meaning to marital life. We thought that by arguing against divorce, we would somehow enable permanent marriages. Well, it didn't work. Marriage has collapsed across the Western world, including, of course, why? Because it wasn't enough simply to proclaim, to say. You don't help people marry and stay married by simply opposing divorce laws or proposing indissolubility, but in understanding that the support systems on which families have long depended are giving way. People need help to commit. They need to learn how to love. They need to learn how to have relationships. And that's why the word grace appears nearly 30 times in Amoris Laetitia, because Francis is recognising that God is seeking to reach people in all those circumstances through his grace, and the church needs to help that. Okay? So Amoris Laetitia doesn't just teach the truth about marriage. It's not a truth document. It is a truth document, but it's not just a truth document. It's actually about showing how God's grace enables us to live lives of self-giving love. Amoris in chapter 8, the famous chapter 8, offers a paradigm for the church's evangelization, precisely of the victims of a world in flux. It's a three-part movement, which is very similar to the Jubilee of Mercy, a three-part movement of accompaniment, discernment, and integration. These three steps, in effect, are the movement of God towards the world. Yeah? First of all, to sense need, to be aware of suffering and anguish. Step one, sense need. Second step, respond concretely. The works of mercy, responding to all kinds of needs, concrete needs. And thirdly, the third stage of integrating, incorporating, saving, creating that space for people to change and learn to belong, which involves a careful attention to the workings of grace in people's broken lives. So in these three steps of mercy, we experience literally the saving love of God. We literally experience the saving love of God. We know God in those three steps. To be saved by Christ is to be saved this way. And to evangelize is to offer that experience. It is an offer always accompanied by joy, because it arises from the grateful remembrance of God's action in us. And that's why Francis is so insistent that we make the effort constantly to recall our own history of salvation, our own history. What is new in Amoris Laetitia is not doctrine and it's not law. What is new is to admit that a pastoral discernment in the internal forum can have practical consequences in the way that discipline is applied in the external forum. So in other words, while there was no change to the law, that no one in mortal sin may receive the Eucharist, what Amoris recognises is that it can no longer be said simply that people who are divorced and remarried are ipso facto in a state of mortal sin or therefore denied sanctifying grace. You can't say that, you can't generalise like that. You have to know people in their individual situation. And therefore, of course, potentially can be admitted to the sacraments. Familiaris had implied the first, but hadn't allowed it to affect the application of sacramental discipline. Amoris does, through the synods, by following through John Paul II's call for discernment and giving conscience its proper role. Because of forms of conditioning and mitigating factors, he says in Amoris, it's possible that an objective situation of sin, which may not be subjectively culpable, a person can be living in God's grace, can love, and also grow in the grace. Anyway, you know the text. But the important thing is the shift that Amoris represents. That Francis is recognising, the Church is recognising the change of era, the cambio de época. That actually the obstacles to living the Christian life involve making space for grace. Now that doesn't reduce the commitment to that life, to the fullness of the moral proposition. In fact, quite the opposite. It's about enabling people to get there. In no way must the Church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage, God's plan in all its grandeur, he says in Amoris Laetitia. And the central chapters of the document don't just make the case for indissolubility, I think very beautifully and compellingly, but it shows how the Church has to enable it and teach it by enabling room for grace. So what the Gospel demands is both the full ideal of the Gospel, what is right, what is good, but also how God, in his divine pedagogy, helps us get there. How the means, in other words, to treat the weak with compassion. We are able to love, Francis is saying after St. Augustine, because we have first been loved. And he says, I understand those who prefer a more rigorous pastoral care which leaves no room for confusion. I understand why, in a context of liquidity, we love certainty. We want to talk about objective this and rules and absolutely clear guidelines and putting clear blue water and clear messages and all the rest of it. But, he goes on to say, I sincerely believe, this is the fruit of his discernment, Jesus wants a church attentive to the goodness which the Holy Spirit sows in the midst of human weakness. It's ironic that his critics have charged him with creating ambiguity, because popes seldom ever speak that categorically or authoritatively, and only when the very truth of the gospel is at stake. So, to conclude, what evangelises ultimately is holiness. Holiness is captivating. It draws people to its source. And what is holiness? Francis describes it beautifully in Gaudete et Exsultate. It is to be merciful and it is to act mercifully. We become Christians not through our obedience of law or ethical precepts, but under the effect of God's grace, from which ethical conversion follows. An evangelising community, he says in Evangelization, has an endless desire to show mercy, the fruit of its own experience of the power of the Father's infinite mercy. It embraces human life, comes close, touches the suffering flesh of Christ in others, and it stands by them. It performs, in other words, the God it represents. Its language is pastoral, it's accessible, it's human, it's simple, it's the language of consolation, of accompaniment. But it's also direct and fearless, unafraid to denounce with prophetic courage all the conditions that oppress the poorest and the most vulnerable, and that impede human flourishing. So in seeking to turn the Church away from this ethicist deviation, to refocus on Christ and his grace, Francis wants us to ask for the grace of consolation. When St. Ignatius speaks of consolation, he speaks about interior happiness, and he uses the word in Spanish, Laetitia, and if you look at the titles of the three apostolic exhortations, Evangelii Gaudium, Amoris Laetitia, Gaudete et Exsultate, the Pope is trying to tell us something, I think. He's clear that there is something that has gone missing in the Christian proclamation, which he's trying to put back. And what is it? That there is no morality without also mercy. There can be no proclamation without joy. Francis told the Jesuits in 2016, but it applies to all of us who evangelize, that their true work was to console the faithful people and through discernment help them so that the enemy of human nature does not rob us of our joy, the joy of evangelizing, the joy of the family, the joy of the church, the joy of creation. So what is good news here is a papacy that puts the sharing of the experience of the love of Christ at the heart of our evangelization. The world in flux does not need more disincarnate knowledge. It doesn't need more distant institutions. It needs the experience of a loving God who is close and concrete, whose truth captivates because it is at the same time both good and beautiful. Hence Francis is called to focus on God's merciful love that precedes any moral or religious obligation on our part, and to perform it. What best communicates the heart of the gospel, he says in Evangelization, are works of love directed to one's neighbour. So this means missionary disciples who have experienced that, the three-stage experience of God's mercy, and who can talk about it and who can proclaim it. It means missionary disciples who do not build caves for the pure to hide in, but create warm fires out in the plain where shivering migrants can find safety and welcome, and we're all shivering migrants in a world of liquidity. The institution is at the service of the mission, which is why Francis can call for a new ecclesial paradigm, such that the Church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation. I hope I've shown you where that idea comes from. That means a new openness to the Holy Spirit, referred to 50 times in Evangelization, and its characteristics and fruitfulness, such as freedom, fearlessness, and newness. So the Francis option is the fruit of a lifetime of discernment by a Jesuit pope, deeply attentive to his times. And it's the fruit of the discernment of the Latin American Church in the first decade of the new millennium. It is the fruit of the discernment that sees how the Church has often reacted badly to the threat posed by globalised technocracy, how it has often retreated into a defensive ethical stance, which is born of desolation, which is a strategy for resistance but not for renaissance. Benedict XVI, as I hope to show, shared this concern, and by allowing and encouraging the Latin American Church and the Palestinian, created space for the Holy Spirit to raise up from Latin America a renewed vision that was perceptible as a new Pentecost in this, already visible in the Synod of 2012. And that's the vision that Francis has made into the source of the universal church. Precisely because it is harder to live the Christian life in a context of a widening gap between society and the church, it is all the more important to facilitate the grace that people need to be holy, and all the more vital that our proclamation be born of the lived experience of that grace. Hence the focus on mercy, hence the curriculum, hence the endless emphasis on the personal encounter with Christ. The Francis option is not the Benedict option, but it was actually the option favoured by Pope Benedict, and I believe by St. Benedict of Nursia. It is to put the encounter with the mercy of Christ at the centre of a world in flux, and to start again from there, in humility